Hi, this is Joe Mullings, and this is The Other Side. Joining us today is David Filmore. David is the executive editor of Market Pathways, and that's a part of MedTech Strategist. And in particular, Market Pathways has an expertise in regulatory, reimbursement, and market access. So I thought chatting with David today would be very interesting, giving the fluidic character of what's going on in the FDA today, and also how we're pivoting on an unprecedented basis in regards to FDA and oversight. So thanks for joining us from Rochester today.
Great to be here, Joe. Thank you.
So it's got to be interesting for you having such a connection and insight into this part of the market. What are you thinking of right now, and what's going on behind the scenes that most people probably don't realize?
Well, I mean, things are just changing at such a quick pace right now. I mean, FDA in particular, as one, obviously the U.S. regulatory agency is just operating on a different type of level, and in terms of the number of policies they're flowing out on a daily basis that are tied to basically treading kind of these new shortcut pathways to getting around the typical regulatory maze in this very, unprecedented situation. So just sort of seeing the cycle of thought there, and the cycle of probably getting feedback from stakeholders, what barriers they're running into, and kind of creating policies to create sort of a regulatory framework to make it work is a big thing. And while, of course, device companies more broadly, not necessarily just working in the emergency specific coronavirus-related technologies, but trying to figure out what the status quo is in terms of getting new technologies through the FDA during this, very, very frenetic time.
So give me an example for viewers who may not be super plugged into what the FDA oversight is. Let's take what would be something the FDA would be involved in when we're thinking about ventilators. So we obviously are accelerating that right now. There's inspection, there's quality, there's reg, there's transportation, there's sterilization. Take me through what they might be thinking about.
Right. So, I mean, obviously there's some existing number of products out there right now that have, that are FDA approved and have some existing oversight that are, obviously flowing through the regular channels and companies are, upscaling production to the extent possible and thinking creatively. But in addition, the issue is simply, are we going to have enough? Where are there products that are used in some way close to ventilators, or ventilators in a different situation that they're not wouldn't be used for a patient exactly of the character that we're going to be dealing with the COVID virus, that could be used differently. Normally, a company can't just go about and say, yes, we think we can validate this device, just use it for this patient. Oh, here's a way you could kind of rejigger this a little bit to readjust where it could be used. But FDA is kind of giving an allowance to say, yes, go ahead. It's all right. I mean, labeling is FDA's oversight, and they're saying, don't worry about the labeling. Let's move forward within a reasonable framework with allowing these products to be used, maybe messing around with the physical nature of them. And as we're talking, is there other types of manufacturers and things that can get involved in making these outside of the medical device industry? And FDA, of course, has to be in the loop of that, just making sure that what they're doing is appropriate and not going to cause more harm than good.
So as an example, we're watching Musk and Tesla lean in and start to deliver ventilators. And are those being made out of a unaudited, unregulated FDA sort of facility? And the FDA saying, okay, in this situation, you're good to go?
I think it's not as simple as that. I mean, I think it's a matter of probably it's a supply chain issue. I don't know what's coming out exactly. Is a full product coming out of Tesla, or is it there's a supply chain that's going through that's Tesla's accelerating, that's then also involving a ventilator company, and so it sort of latches on to a validated process. I think it's that part of it is very fluid. So I saw today, I think in an FDA policy, specifically calling out, not car companies, but the idea of non-medical device manufacturers in a formal guidance document, come talk to us. So there's back and forth conversation going on with those, and I think they're mostly involving current also device companies, in the loop. So exactly how this is going to look out, it still remains to be seen.
Right, but at the end of the day, it's patient first, and let's get these in the hands. And if it's an off-label use or it's not exactly designated for that, as in the past, we would have some severe oversight on it. It's like, let's just save some lives.
exactly. As long as, with some bounds, making sure that, obviously you don't want to cause more harm by something not doing in any way what's supposed to. But yes, exactly.
Historically, regulatory has been sort of governed by borders, right? So we've got the U.S. FDA, we've got, and we'll jump into that, EU MDR, we've
Hmm.
got CFDA, right? We've got regulatory in Japan. For the
Right.
first time, we are facing a scenario where this is a borderless conversation going on in
Right.
regards to regulatory. What are you thinking of, or what are the smart people thinking of in regards to regulatory now it being global, and should we be reevaluating things?
That's a great question. I mean, in the long run, people have been, focused on this issue and told, under the framework of global harmonization. So not with the idea of creating literally a single world regulatory body, but having a system where all the systems link together. So one authority in country X could see what's done in country Y and say, okay, we could trust that. We're not, we could trust that. And to be honest, we're in some areas we're there, and in some areas we are not there. And right now, I think in terms of this in terms of this emergency, I mean, there's certainly a lot of information sharing going on, but the different agencies are definitely operating independently and really having to, you're seeing diagnostic tests go through China, and very separate ones go through FDA, and very separate ones, obviously, discussion about the World Health Organization testing going through Germany. So there's a lot of separate parallel processes going on, and I think there's a good chance that this experience could help expedite, I think, this idea of a global harmonization. Certainly, hopefully, to some extent during this emergency and as we go forward, because there's a lot of interest, certainly on the FDA's part, of getting something closer to, let's say, a single review process where the FDA's one process that can involve a U.S. approval at the same time as a Europe and other area approval. We're not there yet. There's a high interest in that. I think you can't say that this isn't going to push that forward to want to get quicker access everywhere to the best technologies.
Yeah, nothing would be more valuable right now than to have an aggregated data set, or an aggravated, and that's a Freudian
Both, right?
sleep, but an
Yeah.
aggregated data set that would allow us to have lessons learned immediately, having an algorithm asking 1,000,000 questions a second and getting that to the front lines on handling of whether it's drugs, whether it's therapies, whether it's other techniques that are learned around the world. Question for you.
Yep.
We've moved into a digital world clearly over the last 8-9 years in medtech. I've been at this for 3 decades. And managing an analog world, whether it's an extruded catheter or a syringe or a ventilator, should that be a different consideration when you're looking at transferring information and powering information via digital? And should that almost move towards a utility mindset like electricity or water or anything else where that runs across the world to trade this information?
I mean, I think that's a great question. I think certainly it is different. Digital is different than physical, and I think that is very much recognized by, for instance, FDA and, for instance, other world authorities, payers. Increasingly you'll see something like digital tools being involved, not in your typical reimbursement function where you're getting, it's kind of linking into employee health benefits, for instance. It's more of a part of the universe as opposed to a separate product. So I think that the movement is towards that, but obviously there's a hybrid. When you involve digital and it's automatically making healthcare decisions, that's obviously something where there's going to have to be looked at a little bit closer to a diagnostic where there's real health is on the line. But the underlying data flowing and things like that, I do think we need to move, as you say, I mean, to something that flows a little bit more free flowing and gets to where it needs to go without having to abide exactly by this is a stent or a suture type of approach. But it's complicated. There's a lot of different things you could do with data. Some of them are, you can make use as an expert, but we want to make sure, obviously, that that it is, there's got to be some measure, just like you are obviously assuring safety of water supply and electricity supply. There's got to be some framework for ensuring safety and appropriateness of the digital health and digital data supply, I guess.
Yeah, there's always the people that will immediately index to the nefarious side of having access to data and the nefarious use against the population. And I'm just curious on how does that not be the fat kid on the seesaw right now, where you have millions of lives at risk and somebody is going to come up with a potential nefarious use for it. That'll be an interesting conversation to watch go on.
No, I think you're right. And, I think right now everybody is interested in being, a term I've seen in a lot of FDA documents, not just related to digital, but in any case, is maximum flexibility. I've just seen that phrase a number of times, which you haven't seen that phrase typically on the FDA side. So I think everything is up on the table right now. What happens after this is another question, but I think really everything is up on the table right now in terms of moving things forward. I really do get that sense.
So we've got a pause on nearly everything in the medical device industry right now that has a clinical trial associated with it. There's no way to get into hospitals. There's no way to run a clinical trial right now. There's too many things at risk, certainly resources, beds, et cetera. Basically, the entire medtech industry has been put on hold. We've heard that from our client base, and we've also heard it from the elective surgery side. What is that going to mean if you were going to take this downrange 6 or 12 months from now? All of the potential solutions that may be saving additional lives, this tremendously impacts it.
Yeah. I mean, obviously, and particularly the startups that are, depending on that trial for their product. I mean, this is just obviously potentially really devastating. I mean, obviously there is attempts, there is people thinking in the back rooms, in terms of how to get certain trials, either, as you say, a lot have paused. There is some trials that people are trying to keep going. FDA did put out a guidance document specifically around this point, basically giving some openings for, there's obviously going to some protocol violations in your trials based on the reality of the situation. And we're going to try to figure out how to work around that, emphasizing things like virtual checkups and remote monitoring and whatever, and I saw there's at least one public example I saw of a company on their earning, kind of on an off earnings schedule, a breast implant company doing some trial that they are continuing, and they are switching to some virtual check-ins, and they've gotten buy-in from both their IRB and FDA. So, I'm not saying that's going to solve everybody's issue right now. Of course, I mean, this is these are devices, and we're talking about procedures, and so of course that is an issue. But I think this is really making people think and work through, and it is, you got that very big restriction trying to find what you could do creatively in it. I think there is an emphasis on new ways of collecting data, and this is going to accelerate that. And that is starting to happen in people's minds. Definitely what we're hearing talking to sources.
I have heard also in the last couple of days about EU MDR transition being put on hold. Could you shed some light on that?
Right. So just to be, I mean, it's not official yet. So the EU Commission, which is essentially sort of the executive branch of the European government, has said that officially said and owned up to that they are going to put out a proposal to delay the MDR. It should be coming out in early April, the next week or so. So they, that's taken a lot of work. They've been very resistant to want to delay it before this, a public health emergency, even though there's been a lot of calls from the industry just saying the system isn't quite ready. There's too much ambiguity, not enough notified resources of notified bodies to review the products, not enough guidance documents. And they just weren't willing to do that. But now in this situation, they have agreed. But it is a law. The EU MDR is a EU law, which means actual delay requires approval by the Parliament and the Council, which are the legislative bodies. The expectation is that that probably will go through, but we still need to see that happen. And what we haven't also seen is the details. MDR is a very complicated thing. It's not really just one thing. It's many moving parts, new data, a lot of post-market things, unique device identifiers, a whole host of things for software. And different things have different deadlines. Is this going to move back all deadlines? Just some? Will it be simple? Will it be complicated? But yes, at this point, there's at least some progress towards potentially delaying this major regulation, right as everybody's in the middle of this crazy time trying to figure out how to keep technologies on the market.
Yeah, and you'd be hopeful that there was consideration, because you have to think about all the emerging tech companies as well as the companies right now that perhaps are enjoying 50, 100, 200 million in sales and currently right now cannot do anything. And so you've got revenue and obviously profit issues there and employee issues. And now you're going to throw on the onerous EUMDR that was going to be there anyway to come right up behind this could be absolutely devastating for a lot of these organizations, because financially it was already a heavy load for them.
Yeah, and it's, I think the biggest issue is there's just so many moving parts and so ambiguous. There is grace periods built in to be able to use the old system even without a delay, but the confusion of what you do with what, everything, it just wasn't a status quo. And as you have this much change happening and this much emergent need right now, to have things that are not on a stable ground was just, I think, considered too much. Yeah. So that's where we are.
Since you're plugged into, again, reimbursement, regulatory, and market access, what are you concerned with as we get 3, 6, 9, 12 months out from today? The unforeseen, as of today, impact on the medical device industry?
Well, I mean, obviously, as you brought up before, in terms of everything at a standstill now, in terms of clinical development, and I think that is obviously going to have kick-on effects for a little while here, in terms of just delaying everything. Even at just a base, everything is going to be delayed. I do think things are moving, like in terms of like FDA is not just 100. FDA is still open for business in terms of non, other than obviously emergency use focus. They are open for business. They are reviewing applications that are already, let's say, submitted. They are taking obviously not in person, but teleconference meetings. They're not doing inspections. That's going to slow things down. So things are happening. They're happening at a slower rate. I think, to say, I don't know that I could say what the full impact is. I think it's going to be vast for the whole economy, and it depends on how the government's full response and all those details that are being developed right now as we speak. But I do think the key thing now is, don't assume that nothing is happening. Things are happening, and it does make sense to stay in touch, talk. If you have anything going on with the FDA right now, keep in touch with your reviewer. They're working from home just like you. They're dealing with the same things, but they're not just chilling watching Netflix. Same thing with notified body in Europe. Notified bodies are up. Obviously they're prioritizing emergency thing too. So they're kind of the equivalent to the FDA, but in a decentralized way in Europe. They're kind of in a similar boat, and you want to keep in touch with them. Keep in touch with the European country, competent authorities in all different countries. Things are happening. They're not. There's a lot of things. I don't want to overstate what's happening, but things are happening. You do your best to stay in touch, and to don't let things fall back more than they need to, just because you assumed that they weren't going to move forward.
You've mentioned telehealth a few times. We've talked about digital. I think up until about 2 months ago, some people viewed them as eventually coming, and I've even heard others like, it'll never happen. And then clearly, this is going to have a dramatic impact on where digital and data and telehealth looks in the near future. What are your thoughts on that?
Yeah, no, absolutely. I mean, in all fronts, it's just getting, obviously, I already mentioned on the clinical trial side, in terms of, using that as a tool there. And then certainly on the just, everybody's in telehealth right now, patient-wise. If you need to go to the doctor for anything right now, other than this is, this pandemic, you're obviously experiencing some element of telehealth, whether it's a literal, telephone, or more high-tech technologies. And I think, obviously Medicare has, for instance, relaxed some of its restrictions on reimbursement, because that was obviously a major barrier to this. Is clinicians not clearly getting paid for depending on very specific buckets of types of visits they had to fit into, state by state, over state line barriers. A lot of issues that were standing in the way of that. They're trying to push those back in this environment. So I think there's a feeling that certainly we're hearing that it's going to be hard to reclose some of those doors because some of these just make sense to open them. It just seems crazy. Well, you could talk to this person, not to this person, get reimbursed over a web thing, or use some sort of remote monitoring tool, and using a certain code to do it. Making sure you could just flexibility do that. So I think there's a lot of plus. That's expanding, and I think it'll expand. It's going to be hard to move backwards. But we're just gonna have to see. I mean, I have heard also, the different insurance companies, the commercial payers, they're coming up with all these crisis plans to ensure that they're reimbursing for digital health, and this, to make sure patients can get healthcare while they don't have to go see a doctor face to face. But they all have different plans, and that's causing complexity. I've heard, from people in the industry. So, really working on, as we deal with this, and hopefully, how long this goes, but as we push forward and try to respond to this and maybe refine the approaches and get simpler and simpler, that could have some positive benefits as we move forward to making those help the healthcare industry as much as it can.
Yeah, and it'll always be interesting to watch this because, again, the frontline warriors are out there right now doing the dirty work, and then the policymakers will come up behind them and come in, and you've got to hope that this is not going to be a political game or a monetary game, but you hope that policymakers and the bureaucrats who are going to come up behind and hopefully reevaluate the entire system do the right thing when you think about market access, reimbursement, and regulatory approval, that this is maybe has a new team looking over this versus the old guard. So I can say that because I'm not in that in that cohort that you have to play in. So listen, I appreciate your time, David. This has been enlightening, fantastic, and insightful. And I wish you well. Stay healthy, and say hello to our friends over at the MedTech Strategist for us.
Absolutely. I appreciate it, Joe. Yeah, stay healthy yourself, and good luck.
I appreciate it. And this has been Joe Mullings with The Other Side.